She was tired of running, tired of starting over, so she bought an abandoned house no one had wanted for 16 years. She thought it was just a place to disappear. But inside that abandoned house, she found hidden deeds, forgotten letters, and proof of a legacy that had been buried on purpose. What she uncovered wasn't just old land. It was a hidden inheritance, and someone else knew it existed. Before we begin, if you believe quiet choices can change a life, subscribe and stay with this story. Marian Wells had lived in 3 cities over the last 7 years. Each time she left, it wasn't dramatic, just a quiet decision, a packed car, and the early morning light slipping through an unfamiliar windshield. People assumed she was chasing something opportunity. Perhaps, in truth, she was just tired. Tired of starting over. Tired of spaces that never felt like hers. The house she found sat at the edge of a town no one really talked about anymore. It had been empty for 16 years, its listing photos blurred and out of date. The price was low enough to feel suspicious. But Marian didn't question it. She didn't ask who had owned it before or why no one had claimed it. She simply signed the papers and drove 5 hours with a half-full tank and no real plan. When she first saw the house in person, it looked smaller than in the photos, tilted slightly to one side, as if it were leaning away from something. The windows were streaked with years of dust. Vines clung to the front porch. But the silence around it wasn't hostile. It just felt forgotten. She stood there for a long time, hand on the door, not knowing it had already begun. The first few days in the house passed without incident. Marian spent them doing ordinary things, cleaning dust from window frames, sorting through boxes left behind by previous owners, walking the edge of the property in the late afternoon, stopping where the forest thickened and the ground dipped unevenly. Nothing announced itself as unusual. If anything, the house seemed determined to appear unremarkable. It was only on the 4th morning that something began to feel slightly out of place. Marian had been clearing out a narrow storage room near the back of the house. The room was small, barely large enough to stand in comfortably, and smelled faintly of damp wood. As she moved a broken shelf aside, she noticed markings on the floorboards, shallow scratches, running parallel, as though something heavy had been dragged across the floor more than once. She knelt to look closer. The dust around the marks was thick, untouched for years. Whatever had caused them hadn't been moved recently. That alone wasn't strange. Old houses carried the weight of forgotten habits. Still, the marks led directly to the far wall, stopping just short of it. There was no door, no panel, just wall. Marian stood there for a long moment, hand resting against the wood. She told herself she was imagining significance where there was none. Fatigue did that. Isolation, too. She moved on. Later that afternoon, while sorting through a shallow cabinet beneath the stairs, she found a stack of papers bound together with twine. At first glance, they looked like old receipts, yellowed, brittle, folded carefully. But as she sat down and began unfolding them, she realized they weren't receipts at all. They were land records, not modern ones. These were older, typed and handwritten, bearing seals she didn't recognize and dates that stretched back nearly 70 years. Names appeared again and again. Some crossed out, some underlined. One name appeared more than any other. Wells? Marian felt a slow tightening in her chest. Wells wasn't an uncommon name, she reminded herself. Coincidences happened. Still, she kept reading. The documents referenced parcels of land far beyond the house itself, wooded acreage, boundary lines marked with vague descriptions north of the creek, east of the old stone marker, beyond the ridge. The language was imprecise, almost intentionally so. At the bottom of the stack was a folded map. It took her several minutes to understand what she was looking at. The map showed the town, the surrounding forest, and shaded sections, large ones that did not match current property divisions. The house sat at the center of those shaded areas like a quiet anchor. Marian folded the map carefully and set it aside. That night, she didn't sleep well, not because she was afraid, but because her thoughts wouldn't settle. The house felt different now, not heavier, but more deliberate, as if its silence had gained direction. The next morning, Marian drove into town for the first time since arriving. The town itself was small, understated. A general store, a diner with a faded sign, a post office that looked older than the road it sat on. At the diner, she ordered coffee and eggs and listened. She didn't ask questions at first. She didn't mention the house. She let the conversations around her move naturally, comments about weather, about logging permits being delayed, about land that had been tied up for years with no clear owner. Eventually, she asked casually, "Do you know much about the old place out past the ridge? The one that's been empty a long time?" The woman behind the counter paused just slightly. "Most folks don't buy that place," she said. "Too much history. Too many unknowns." "What kind of unknowns?" Marian asked. The woman shrugged. "Ownership, mostly. Boundaries never sat right. People argued about it years ago. Then they stopped." "Why?" "No one could prove anything." Marian didn't press further. Back at the house, she laid the documents out across the table, smoothing them carefully. She compared the map to a modern one on her phone. The discrepancy was undeniable. According to these papers, the land tied to the house was far more extensive than the listing had suggested. This wasn't just a forgotten home. It was a forgotten claim. Late that afternoon, Marian found what confirmed it. Behind a loose panel in the hallway, one she hadn't noticed before was a metal box, rusted but intact. Inside were deeds, original ones, signed, notarized, sealed. The names matched the documents she'd already found, and they all pointed to the same conclusion. The land had never been sold. It had been hidden. Marian sat on the floor for a long time after that, the box open in front of her. The house creaked softly around her, settling into the evening. She didn't feel triumph. She didn't feel fear. She felt responsibility. Whoever had owned this land had chosen obscurity over conflict, silence over exposure, and somehow, through a chain of quiet decisions and overlooked records, it had ended up with her. Not because she searched for it, but because she had stopped running long enough to notice. The house hadn't changed. But Marian had... The day after Marian found the deeds, she didn't open the metal box again. Instead, she left it sitting on the kitchen table, untouched. She walked the perimeter of the property with a notebook in her hand, tracing the lines she had memorized from the map. Some landmarks were obvious: the dry creek bed, the leaning poplar, a rusted fence swallowed by ivy. Others had been lost to time. She tried not to read too much into what she was doing. It was easy to get caught up in stories that didn't belong to you. But there was a strange pull in her chest. Not curiosity, exactly, something quieter. A need to understand what had been left behind. Back inside, as the sun dipped low, Marian opened the smallest of the drawers in the cabinet beneath the stairs. She hadn't checked that one yet. It stuck slightly, swollen from years of damp air, but after a firm tug, it slid open with a sigh. Inside was a bundle of cloth, wrapped tightly with twine. It was heavier than it looked. She brought it to the table, undid the knot, and slowly unwrapped it. Inside were small objects, wrapped individually, each piece tucked carefully, as though by someone who believed they might not return for a long time. The first item was a brass key, thick and old-fashioned, with the initials WLH etched faintly into the handle. The second was a sealed envelope, unaddressed. The paper had yellowed, but the wax seal remained intact, pressed with a crest she didn't recognize, a tree surrounded by a circle of stars. She didn't open it, not yet. The third object was what held her attention, a folded square of oilskin. When she peeled it open, a metal disc fell onto the table about the size of a coin. But heavier. It was tarnished, almost black, with markings that had worn down over time. But Marian could still make out 3 letters. Say, and beneath them, a date 1897. She turned the disc over. On the back, faint but legible, was a phrase etched in precise script, buried under what no one watches. Marian stared at the words for a long time. There was no map, no coordinates, just that sentence. She looked back at the land records. Most of the land surrounding the house had once been fields, according to the annotations, orchards, open pasture, some leased to neighboring farmers. But there was one parcel noted simply as the hollow behind the well, with no further explanation. Marian hadn't noticed any well. Not yet. She spent the next day walking the land again. This time, she focused on the slope behind the house, where the terrain dipped gently before climbing into thicker trees. The area was overgrown, hidden beneath layers of leaf fall and moss. But eventually, near a crumbling stone wall half buried in ivy, she saw the remains of what might once have been a well. It had been filled in, poorly. The stones were uneven, cracked. Some had caved inward. The center was sunken, not completely collapsed, but dipped like a forgotten grave. Weeds grew in thick clumps across the top. She stood there for a long while, hands in her pockets, listening. The woods were quiet, not silent but watchful. That evening, Marian lit a fire in the stove and opened the sealed envelope from the drawer. Inside was a letter, short, written in a slow, deliberate hand. To the one who finds this, if you're here, then the others never came back. That's good. They weren't ready. What's buried isn't gold. It's weight. It's memory. Some things need to be kept, not claimed. If you're not willing to carry that, leave it buried. If you are, dig slow. It wasn't signed. There was no instruction. No mention of what had been hidden. But Marian felt it. Not just the mystery, the responsibility. The care someone had taken to make sure whatever had been hidden would only be found by someone willing to understand it, not just possess it. She didn't sleep much that night. Not from fear, from knowing. The following morning, she returned to the hollow behind the house, shovel in hand. Not to conquer, not to take, just to see. The soil was heavier than it looked. Marian dug slowly, not because she was unsure of where to begin, but because it felt wrong to rush. The sun had barely risen, and the hollow behind the house still held onto the cold of the night. Her breath came out in soft clouds, and every stroke of the shovel sent a dull thud through the earth. She didn't expect to find gold. She wasn't even sure she expected to find anything. But something kept her hands moving. After the first hour, the top layer gave way to older, denser soil. Roots curled through it like veins. Stones clinked against the shovel. The silence around her shifted, not breaking, but adjusting as though the woods were listening. Then, beneath a flattened slab of rock, she heard it. A hollow sound. She set the shovel aside and brushed at the earth with her hands until a corner of wood emerged. Not a box, more like a crate, weathered, bound in rusted iron at the edges. No lock. No markings this time. Just age. She didn't open it immediately. She sat beside it instead, her gloves resting on her knees, and for the first time, she realized she didn't feel like a visitor anymore. She felt like the next person in line. The crate, when opened, didn't reveal treasure, not in the way stories use the word. Inside were documents rolled and tied with ribbon, layered with care. Beneath them, sealed jars containing photographs, some faded beyond clarity, others crisp and recent enough to startle her. Names, ledgers, letters, a copy of a will dated 1938, signed in a hand that trembled near the bottom. A deed she hadn't seen before, older than the rest. And one envelope with her name on it. Marian Wells. It stopped her. There was no mistaking it. Her name, in ink, faded but legible. She turned the envelope over with a strange calm and opened it. If this finds you, then you belong here. Not because you claimed it, but because you stayed long enough to listen. You don't need to understand everything now. But the land needs a voice. Let it be yours. There was no signature. No explanation of how anyone could have known she would come. Only the quiet weight of having been expected. She didn't cry, but she sat there until the sun had moved past the edge of the trees, and her fingers were stiff from the cold. When she finally brought the crate inside, she laid each item on the floor of the main room, no longer sorting as a stranger, but as someone trying to put history back in order. The records weren't financial. They weren't legal in any modern sense, but they carried lineage, continuity. Responsibility? That night, she wrote in her notebook. There's no ownership here, only stewardship. This place didn't need a buyer. It needed someone who wouldn't look away. She closed the book gently and stared into the fire. This wasn't about inheritance in the way her mind had first assumed. There was no fortune, no announcement, no validation from a distant relative. There was only the quiet, intentional act of someone, many someones, choosing to leave something behind and hoping that someday someone would care enough to return. She thought about how she had found the house almost by accident, almost too easily. She thought about the listing agent's vague language, the price so low it felt like a shrug, about how none of the neighbors had asked questions, as if they, too, had been told, leave it be. But the house hadn't wanted to be left. It had waited. And now, Marian could feel herself being drawn into something that didn't require her to fix or prove or explain, only to remain. In the morning, she would go to town. She would ask for historical surveys. She would check the county archives, not for ownership claims, but for burial records, land transfers, anything that connected the people in the photos to the ground they had once stood on. Not because she needed to know everything, but because she had already become part of the story. Marian didn't go to the county records office right away. She meant to. The documents she had found, land records, family names, burial notations, deserved to be verified. But something held her back. Not hesitation, more like reverence. She spent the next 2 days walking the property again, this time not looking for anything, just observing, listening, as though the house and its land were still deciding how much more they wanted to give. On the third morning, the sound of a vehicle on gravel broke the stillness. It was unfamiliar, not loud, but distinct in a place that had known only birdsong and shifting branches for weeks. Marian looked up from where she was sweeping the porch and saw a pale blue truck coming up the overgrown path. The tires crunched slow and cautious, like the driver was unsure whether to proceed. The truck stopped a short distance from the porch. A man stepped out. He looked to be in his late 40s. Work boots, denim shirt, hands that looked like they built things more than they wrote them down. He raised a hand in a polite wave. "Morning," he said. "Didn't mean to startle you." "You didn't," Marian replied, though her grip on the broom had tightened. "I'm Daniel." He glanced back at the truck. "I do repair work out this way. I heard someone had finally moved into the old Wells place. Thought I'd check if you needed anything." Marian nodded, unsure what to say. The name Wells sounded different coming from someone else, as if the house didn't just belong to her, but to memory. "I'm Marian," she said finally. Daniel studied the porch steps, then the windows. "House has good bones," he said, "but it's been waiting a long time." Marian didn't correct him. She stepped aside slightly, a silent offer to come closer. He didn't. But his gaze settled gently on the crate by the door, still half filled with documents and photos she hadn't brought back inside. He didn't ask. And that, more than anything, made her trust him. Over the next few weeks, Daniel returned never uninvited, never overstepping. Sometimes with tools, sometimes just passing through. He helped repair a leaking gutter, then a loose panel in the side wall. Marian offered coffee once. He accepted, but only after asking if it was trouble. It never felt like intrusion. What surprised Marian most was how little he tried to know. He didn't ask what she was doing with the land, didn't question the papers she sometimes left drying on the porch, newly cleaned of mildew. When she mentioned the deed that showed expanded borders, he nodded as if he had already assumed as much. "People used to say this land wrapped around the creek and touched the tree line," he said. "Most folks forgot that, or pretended to." "Why pretend?" she asked. Daniel had shrugged. "Because it's easier to say something doesn't matter than admit it was taken." That answer stayed with her. It echoed in her thoughts as she spent long evenings sorting photographs, making notes, redrawing the property lines by hand. Not for legal reasons, though that would come, but because it helped her understand the shape of what had been entrusted to her. There were names she hadn't heard before, margins scribbled with arrows and numbers, dates that didn't match official records, mentions of shared planting rights, and no fence beyond this point. Agreements made by handshake, not contract. This wasn't just land. It was memory, lived across generations. One evening, as she and Daniel sat on the porch watching the tree line dim with dusk, she asked, "Why do you think they left it like this? Buried? Quiet?" He didn't answer right away. "Then because they knew someone would try to take it, and someone else would forget why it mattered." Marian nodded slowly. She thought of how many times she'd run from places that didn't feel like hers. How this place, without asking anything, had given her a responsibility no one else had noticed. That night, she pulled out one of the larger maps from the crate. She marked the corners of the land as best she could from what she'd seen. And then, at the bottom, wrote, "This is not for sale. This is not forgotten. This is being remembered." For the first time, the house felt less like a question, and more like a beginning. It was a quiet morning when Marian received the envelope. It arrived without ceremony, no knock at the door, no delivery truck, just resting on the porch rail, sealed in a plain manila fold, weighed down by a flat stone. There was no return address. She stood staring at it for a long moment before picking it up. Inside 3 sheets of paper. The first was a photocopy of the original 1938 deed, identical to the one she had found buried in the crate weeks earlier. The second was a map, modern. Clean, overlaid with proposed development zones marked in red. The third was a typed note. "If this land is yours, you'll need to prove it. Others are preparing to claim it. Time is short. You were not meant to find it." No name, no contact, just the implied presence of someone watching. Marian placed the documents on the table and sat down slowly. She had expected resistance at some point. The land was too large, too quietly placed, too forgotten in the way that made it valuable to people who built strip malls and quiet luxury communities. But she hadn't expected it to come this soon, or this directly. That afternoon, she drove to the county records office. The clerk was polite but vague. Yes, Some of the surrounding land was marked for review. Yes, older deeds existed, but many of them hadn't been fully digitized. When Marian showed her copy of the 1938 deed, the clerk narrowed her eyes. "Where did you find this?" Marian answered evenly. "It was part of the house's documents. Sealed." The clerk nodded, but didn't press further. She simply said, "If you want to file a formal claim, we'll need a survey. And someone to verify the chain of title." Chain of title? The phrase echoed in Marian's mind as she left the building. It sounded clinical, procedural, but to her, it meant something more personal, a thread of memory that hadn't broken. Back at the house, Daniel was already there, stacking lumber near the edge of the porch. He looked up when he saw her face. "They're coming," she said simply. He didn't ask who. Instead, he nodded toward the tree line. "Then we build the fence." It wasn't a wall of exclusion, not a barrier, just a line, a visible marker that said someone is paying attention now. In the evenings, they worked on organizing the documents Marian had found, scanning them, labeling, placing them in archival sleeves. Daniel offered the name of a local historian he trusted. "She doesn't do it for money," he said. "She does it to remember things people would rather forget." Marian wrote a letter to the historian. She included copies of the land maps, the deed, and a simple note. "I'm not trying to fight anyone. I'm just trying not to disappear." A week passed. Then one morning, Daniel returned from the back of the property with a small box in his hand. Wooden, dusty. He said nothing, just set it down and opened it. Inside were letters, dozens wrapped in faded ribbon. Many were addressed to Marian Wells. Marian had never heard the name. The oldest stamp bore the year 1903. She spent the day reading through them. Most were mundane, notes between family members, neighbors, merchants. But one stood out. It was written in hurried script, ink blotting the page. "We buried the marker just past the cedar bend. She said it must be covered again before autumn. No one else knows. Not even the boy." There was no context. But Marian knew the cedar bend. It was a twist in the forest path just beyond the edge of what had once been orchard. That evening, with lantern in hand, she walked the trail alone. The sun was dipping low, and the air had the scent of coming rain. Near the bend, beneath a pile of soft stones and leaves, she found a small iron plaque. It was green with age, nearly unreadable. She brushed away the dirt with the sleeve of her coat. The inscription was worn, but clear enough. "Wells family boundary, witnessed and blessed, August 1892. It wasn't legal. It wasn't a surveyor's post. But it was older than every claim made since and placed there by hands who had known the land long before anyone had questioned it. As she carried the plaque back to the house, Marian realized something she hadn't until now. She wasn't fighting for land. She was becoming part of a place that had been waiting for someone to stay. That night, as wind moved through the walls and the fire cracked low, she sat at the same table where she had first read the hidden letter weeks ago. And this time, she wrote something new. They think silence means surrender. But here, silence was memory. And now, it's waking up. The letter arrived with official markings. This time, there was no mystery, just the weight of bureaucracy. A development firm had filed a claim disputing the original 1938 deed. Their attorneys requested an immediate review. They cited land left unmaintained, unclear ownership, and failure to register intent of preservation. The letter ended with a date, a hearing, 30 days. Marian placed the envelope on the windowsill beside a jar of dried lavender. She didn't panic. She didn't cry. Instead, she boiled water for tea, carried the cup to the back steps, and sat looking out at the field that sloped down to the cedar bend. The wind moved gently across the grass, rustling in long, unbroken lines. The earth did not rush. It had waited longer than any of them. That night, Daniel returned with a large wooden box tucked under his arm. "I had this made," he said, setting it carefully on the floor. "If we're going to show what matters, it should be seen clearly." Inside was a handcrafted display documents preserved behind glass. The boundary plaque now cleaned and mounted, side by side with letters, photographs, and copies of the family map Marian had restored. It wasn't a legal exhibit. It was memory made visible. They spent the next few weeks preparing, not to argue, not to fight, but to reclaim presence. Marian worked with the historian Daniel had mentioned. Together, they tracked down descendants of the families referenced in the documents, people who remembered stories, not laws. Several agreed to write letters of support, recalling oral histories that matched the names Marian had come to know through faded ink and fragile pages. One woman sent a photograph. It showed her grandfather as a child, standing beside a tree Marian now passed every day. On the back, in shaky handwriting planted on Wells land, 1915. We were told never to cut it. Marian added it to the display. A week before the hearing, a local newspaper requested an interview. She declined. "This isn't a headline," she said. "It's a restoration." The night before, she was set to appear before the county board. Marian couldn't sleep. She walked the perimeter of the land under a moon that hung low and full, its light painting soft silver across the field. The forest whispered quietly. As she passed the hollow behind the old well, she stopped and placed her hand on the ground. "I'm not here to win," she whispered. "I'm here to stay." The hearing room was small. No cameras, just a long table, a row of officials, and a few unfamiliar faces in suits who looked at Marian as though she were an obstacle, not a person. They spoke first about plans, progress, permits, about how land unused was land wasted. Then Marian stood, and for the first time, she wasn't uncertain. She laid out the crate, the maps, the letters, the testimony. And finally, she said, "This isn't about development. It's about something older than profit. This land holds the memory of people who asked for nothing but to be left alone. And if no one else will speak for that, then I will." There was no applause, only silence. But Marian knew, in that moment, she had already done what the land had asked of her to remember it aloud. Weeks passed. No final decision came. But one morning, she found a different kind of letter in the mailbox. No seal, no claim, just a short, handwritten note. The hearing left us quiet. That may be the greatest testimony of all. Thank you for not forgetting. It wasn't signed, but it didn't need to be. From then on, the calls stopped. No more letters. The proposed development disappeared quietly from the public ledger. Marian didn't declare victory. She simply planted 2 new trees by the cedar bend, one for the past, one for what came next. Daniel built a small bench nearby. They never carved their names into it. They just let it weather with time. And when neighbors passed through or hikers asked what this land was, Marian didn't give speeches. She just said, "It's where stories stayed because someone finally listened." That fall, the wind returned stronger. The trees bent but didn't break. And Marian Wells stayed not to fight, not to flee, but to live on land that had once been waiting. Now, finally, it could rest. Sometimes, we inherit more than property. We inherit silence, unanswered questions, stories no one wanted to carry. Marian Wells didn't go looking for a fight, or for a legacy. She simply stopped running long enough to notice the quiet around her wasn't emptiness. It was memory waiting to be seen. The lesson was simple. Preserving the past isn't about clinging to it. It's about respecting the lives that came before ours. And sometimes, just by staying still, by choosing not to erase what is inconvenient, we become the stewards of something far greater than ourselves. If this story stayed with you, subscribe for more quiet, powerful journeys. And if you know someone who believes some places are worth remembering, share it with them. Sometimes staying is the most courageous choice.